طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So today inshallah we're going to start chapter 4. Chapter 4 talks about key distribution and user authentication. To some of you these two topics might be a little bit different from each other, but we will see that in this chapter actually in many cases most of the systems they use these two techniques together, integrated, to provide authentication and generate keys, both at the same time. So we'll discuss that. So starting from this chapter, really, you will see that we are moving away from discussing cryptographic techniques. And starting from today, you will see that we are trying to leverage the techniques that we have already studied into real-life networking issues and problems. And we'll try to use symmetric cryptography and public key or public cryptography in distributed systems to try to exchange keys and provide some user authentication. So in other words, we're starting part 2 of the course. Part 1 focused on cryptographic techniques. Part 2 talks about how to leverage these techniques in networking and distributed systems. So that's part 2. So this is network level security, using the cryptographic techniques in network level security. And the last part is going to focus on system level security, which includes intrusion detection, firewalls, and things. Okay, so this is to put this in perspective as a global picture. So in this course, we will discuss, or in this chapter, we will discuss key distribution systems. And one of the most famous and the oldest systems, which is called KERBEROS, which is developed by MIT. And then we will also discuss the certificates standards and how we exchange certificates in directory systems or directory service standards. So to start, in most computer security contexts, user authentication is the fundamental building block and the primary line of defense. So by user authentication, we mean something a little bit different from message authentication. We started message authentication in the previous chapter, if you remember. And for that, we used MAC, or message authentication codes. And these types of message authentication is used to guarantee the integrity of the data as well as the authenticity of the sender in a point-to-point communication scenario. So if two communicating parties are communicating, so each party needs to make sure that the message is coming from an authorized or authenticated source, from a well-identified source, and the message itself has data integrity. Okay, so that message authentication is for point-to-point communication. The user authentication is slightly different. User authentication is guaranteed by kind of login or biometric kind of credentials, and that's a building block before you can exchange keys, you can exchange anything. Okay, so usually this message authentication, user authentication is a prerequisite before you start exchanging keys or establishing any kind of communication. And it can also be a building block to guarantee the authorization of a user to access a certain system. Okay, so you log on to a big system, and we just want to make sure that you are authorized to use, for example, email service or storage space or web browsing or anything. Okay, so user authentication is a prerequisite to all these things. So that's why we call that we highlight the fact that it's a fundamental building block and it's the first line of defense, because 80% of the security attacks happen because of a breaching on your credentials. More than 80% of the attacks happen because simply there is a breach on your credentials. If that happens, then we don't have any line of defense, really. Because we use that to exchange keys. And we use keys to guarantee message integrity, to guarantee authentication of the message that is coming from authentic source, and so on and so forth. So if the first line of defense is broken, everything else is broken easily. So user authentication is the basis for most types of access control and user accountability. So again, not only message authentication. So user authentication is a prerequisite to message authentication, as we said. And we'll talk about examples in this chapter. But also, user authentication is a prerequisite to access control. Access control, which means that we need to make sure that you have the proper authorization and privileges to access certain parts of the system. And you may have like an admin privilege, you may have like a normal user privilege, you may be allowed to use certain parts of the systems but not the others, and so on. Okay? So user authentication is a prerequisite to all these things. And by user accountability, we mean that we need to monitor, for example, your used space and make sure that it does not go beyond the quota that is assigned to you, and so on. So for that, there are two sets of standards. There is RFC 4949, which is done by IETF, or the Internet Security Glossary. It defines the user authentication as the process of verifying an identity claimed by a person or a system entity. Okay? A person to access a system entity. Or by any, as we will see later, any subsystem or any server or any process can actually claim that identity as well. There are two aspects to this identification step, which is the fact that the user or any applicant can give certain user ID and password, which is the credentials, and the verification step, which is to verify that this user is authenticated. And in many cases, once we verify your identity, we give you a proof of this. Okay? And the proof can be given in a form of, as we will see later, in a form of system-generated kind of, whether it's a token or a ticket that confirms that you are authorized to use it for certain type of service. That you log on due to your successful authentication, that you have the permission to use a certain service or to access a certain server. So we give you like a ticket for this, as we will see. So NIST, which is another standard body, it has the standards 800-63, which focuses on electronic authentication guideline. And it defines this electronic user authentication as the process of establishing confidence in a certain user identity. You are claiming a certain identity, so we need to verify that you are really identified to be the person you claim you are. And systems can use this authenticated identity to determine if an authenticated individual is authorized to perform a particular functions. So in many cases, this authentication and the transaction or other authorized function take place across an open network, like the internet. So this authentication process can be done by presenting your credentials on an open network, like you are sending your credentials on the internet. So the implication of this is that, well, does that mean that my password is going to be sent as a clear text? Is that really what it is? Of course, we have to be careful that we cannot send your password because this is your first line of defense. So we have to worry about that. But equally often, this authentication can happen inside a local network. And why we are distinguishing between those two cases is that the security precautions, of course, when it comes to local private network, is different from internet. So definitely when we move from a local private network to an internet, of course, our thinking about security precautions can change dramatically, right? So we don't have to have the same level of security on private networks or local network as we do for a public network or the internet. All right, so NIST, in that standard, the 800 standard, they define a very abstract and very generic model for architecture, the architecture for authentication. So this architecture is divided into two major parts. The first part, which is on the left-hand side here, it actually defines how the user registers his identity, okay? And create, based on his or her identity, they need to create certain credentials, okay? Once you create your credentials, later on you can present, on this right-hand sidebar, you can present your credentials to any system, and this system should have a verifier, okay, which can prove your credentials and give you, a guarantee or a successful authenticated assertion to authorize you to access the relying party, which is the server or the service that you are trying to access. So on the left-hand side, initially you do the user registration. So first, you need to present your identity in terms of information fields. So you need to give me your name, your number, so on and so forth. And depending on the system, this piece of information can be, very abstract, or it can be very rigorous. Okay? And I give you some, or the system, or what we call the registration authority. These are abstract names, by the way. Like in real systems, these could have, and we will see that these could have different names. But this, in terms of this abstract model, which is part of the standard, they use this terminology. So the registration authority is the entity or the process or the server which is responsible for taking your information still. And then it gives you identity proofing. So based on your information, I'm going to give you a proof of identity that, okay, you are really that person. Sometimes, like for مثلا Google, if you create a new account or something, this identity proofing should be as easy as you are telling me that you are Mohammed Said. Okay, I accept. Okay. And in some cases, like for example, if you're registering in Revenue USA or like a tax organization or something, then no, you have to give me your passport number, you have to give me social security number, your credit card information in some cases, and I have to probably verify that from a different system to make sure that this is really all this information, and then I give you identity proofing that you are really identified to be that person. And if there is no match, then I don't give you that identity proofing. So based on this registration, the registration authority will send confirmation to a credential service provider. This is actually a typo. This credential service service provider. Okay, this CSP will engage with the subscriber or the person to try to create two things: to create the credentials, which is in a form of, for example, user ID and password, or I can probably ask you for some questions and answers and so on and so forth. So I can make these credentials in any way, shape, or form. In some cases, I can ask you for your fingerprint, for your iris, things like that. So I can create some credentials for you. Now that your identity is proved, now I can create some credentials for you, which you can use to access this system later on. here on this right hand side. Okay, so when you create your credentials, I'm going to give you a token that confirms the fact that you are authenticated, or you are really authorized to access that system, or to use this token later on to access this system. So this type of communication, so first I'm going to create some kind of token and credentials, okay? And in that case, the registration process is done totally, which means that I proved your identity and I created and confirmed your credentials, okay? So now, the outcome of this is that you have authenticated credentials, confirmed credentials, and a token which confirms that. Okay? Then later on, the subscriber or the claimant can use these credentials and the token to verify himself as an authenticated person to access a relying party, or to access a server or a service. Okay? So now the registration is done. It's once and for all. So we have all been through this before. So this part is done offline. Okay? And this part now is done all the time. When you log on to the system, you present your credentials and so on, and then the verifier will verify your credentials and token, which is communicated from the credential service provider. So the credential service provider will communicate this to the verifier, which can be engaged with the subscriber through some authentication protocol. We'll talk about a specific authentication protocol later on. So the subscriber and the verifier will get engaged into authentication procedure to present the credentials and the token, and on the other side, the verifier will say, okay, this person is authenticated. So the relying party, this relying party could be email server, or anything, or cloud system, or something like this. It can now engage directly with this user in direct communication. Okay? So this is a very generic and abstract model for authentication. So we will focus more on this part, and at the end of this chapter, we'll focus a little bit on this part. Okay, so means of authentication. I think we are all aware of these things. So this could be based on something the individual knows, like a PIN number, like a username, password, or something like this. It can be based on something the individual possesses, like example, the cryptographic key. So this cryptographic key, assuming that I have a shared key, or I have a key of some sort, I can use that to authenticate myself to the system, assuming that the system knows this key. And we'll see how this happens. It can be based on electronic key cards. I'm not sure if some of you have used that. I used to have this when I used to work in IBM in Canada. They used to give us like a electronic token. It's a separate device. And this separate device, whenever you try to log onto the system, you open that and you see like a random number generated. This random number somehow is known by the system. So once you enter that number, it can be used for authentication. And this number changes all the time. Or a smart card, or anything, or a physical key, or something else. Or it could be based on something the user is. It's like your biometrics. It's like your iris, your fingerprint, something like this. Or it could be based on something the individual does, like your speech, your habit of typing on the keyboard, specific, pattern of typing on a keyboard, or your EEG, or whatever. But this is something you do, so could be voice or something like this. All right, so based on that, we will divide this process, the authentication process, into two major categories. One is to do the user authentication, and we'll use that for key distribution, okay, using symmetric encryption. So we are all familiar with the symmetric encryption. We'll use that for user authentication and key distribution. So that's that part. And later on, we'll talk about using public encryption, public key and private key and so on, later on in the other part of this chapter. So in terms of requirements, the two parties must share the same key. Of course, for symmetric key encryption, both parties need to share the same key. And that key must be protected from access by others. So we know that. So frequent key changes are usually desirable to limit the amount of data compromised if the attacker learns the key. And what that means is that if we use the same key for a long period of time, we'll become more and more prone to attacks, right? Because the hacker or the attacker can run some crypto analysis to try to guess what the key is. But if we change that key every now and then, this makes the communication more secure and more proof against any kind of attack. So but even when you do the crypto analysis, by the time you try to guess the key, I will have changed the key. So you have to go from scratch on guessing the new key, and that continues on, and you will never be able to break the communication. So especially when it comes to symmetric encryption, there is a desire to change that key, that shared key, every now and then. That's a rule of thumb. So with that said, we have two processes or two different paradigms in a system. One is key distribution techniques. By key distribution here, we mean the delivering of a key to two parties to start to communicate. Okay? So we need to somehow have two parties have the same key. So we need to distribute that key to these two parties to allow them to start communication. So that's key distribution. Okay? Key management. Key management is the fact that given large number of keys, okay, so imagine if we have a centralized server that has a set of keys like this. So at some point, we say, okay, so this key goes to node A and node B, that they can use it for communication. Okay? So we need to manage and protect these keys, and then we need to distribute these keys to the different parties to facilitate the communication. So managing these keys is what we call a key management, where how to store these keys and so on and so forth. And then when we distribute these keys to the communicating parties, we call this a key distribution. A good research topic, by the way, which is not highlighted in the book, is what we call key selection. It's actually not covered in the book, but we have actually identified that this is one of the areas of research that not many people are focusing on. The fact that when you distribute these keys, you have to be aware that these keys are uncorrelated for parties that have some correlation between them. Okay, so you need to be careful that when you distribute certain keys to certain communicating parties, that these keys should have no correlation between each other. Like, for example, if you know that two wireless devices, they are communicating together, and another two wireless devices, they are in the range of each other. Okay? So the keys that should be distributed to these communicating parties should have no correlation whatsoever, because if they have some correlation, then if you know the keys of one, you can easily guess the other key, if they have certain correlation. So that's not part of key management, or it is and it's not. Yani. So when you manage the keys, as part of managing that, you have to distribute keys to users carefully, not in an ad hoc basis. You have to really distribute certain keys to certain communication parties.
But Doctor, didn't we say that the key generation algorithm can guarantee randomness and unpredictability?
Yes, to some extent. Yes, you're right. But sometimes these keys are not generated from the same random generator, right? Because maybe multiple servers will use different random generators. So as part of the key management and key distribution, you need to make sure that when you distribute these keys to different parties, that really these keys, they have no... So if you have, for example, two communicating parties here and two communicating parties very far away, okay? So there is... you could have some correlation between the two, one way or another. Because you have less probability, for example, that one of them will come in the range of others and will be able to guess the keys and stuff like that. What I'm trying to say is that that's an area of research, really, to select these keys strategically, to try to position them to parties carefully. It's not like a random process. Yeah. Anyway, so that's key distribution and key management and the difference between the two. Talk about these two as we move forward. All right. So now, how can we have two communicating parties to share the same key? Because here we're talking about symmetric encryption. So we can do that by simply saying, okay, so if A wants to communicate to B, so A will physically hand this key manually, physically hand this key to B. Or a third party can select the key for them. So instead of A selecting the key and then deliver it manually to B, no, there is one third party will create that, because this centralized party is going to be responsible for generating the keys for everyone. Okay? And then manually, we can get this key in a form of a file or something like this, and we physically move it to A and B. Of course, 1 and 2 may be feasible if you're talking about a small point-to-point link in a private network or something like this. So between us within an office or something, we're trying to communicate, so we can use moving keys manually. But when it comes to, if we're talking about remote network, end-to-end communication in a distributed system that you have hundreds of nodes, this manual delivery of the keys becomes really prohibitive. It's not possible. So if A and B have previously used a key, so one party could transmit the new key encrypted by the current key. So we have a shared key now, but we want to share another secret key. So we can use the current key to encrypt the new key, and we can share it together easily. And once we share it, we can use the new key and forget about the old key. Something like that. Okay? So we can breed on these keys as we move forward through the communication. And again, we are doing this because we don't want to use one key for a long period of time. So these keys need to be recycled every now and then. So that's one way of recycling, is to use the current key to encrypt the new key. Are you following? Is that okay? ماشي حاجة?
Doctor, the whole purpose of recycling, as we said, is that in case if the communication is broken, the amount of data compromised should be minimal.
No, not really that. The more time you use the same key, the more chance it is for the attacker to do cryptanalysis and guess that key. That's what we're trying to avoid. Because in this case, if an attacker breaks on one key, he can easily get all the following keys, right? So, but what you're trying to do here is to reduce the amount of time that you are using the same key. Okay? So by doing this, you try to make the chance for an attacker to guess that key less. You see what I mean? So you are... Okay, so this is A, and this is B. Now they are using key 1. Okay? So if I'm using this key 1 forever, okay? So by doing cryptanalysis, I can guess that key. Because, you know, we have, like, the worst case is exhaustive search, and we can get that key. Okay? So after a very, 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 very long time, I try to use that key to encrypt another key. Okay? If that key is broken into, I can decrypt and get key 2. Okay? But if we're saying that key 1 will be used, let's say, for 1 hour, and then after this hour we have to use key 1 to encrypt key 2. Once we use key 1 to encrypt key 2, now we're using key 2 and we throw away key 1. That's it. Okay? If we're doing this every hour, then we're fine. Because in 1 hour, there is a very small chance that a user can break into this communication and guess that key. واضحة كده؟ So that's the issue with the point number 3 is that, you know, if an attacker gets 1 key, خلاص, that's it. So the breaking into the communication will happen from now on. If A and B each have an encrypted connection to a third party, and we'll see about how this happens, then C, which is the centralized party or the third party, could deliver this key to A and B. So this is like this. So now A and B, they have secure connection somehow. This is secure and this is secure with C. So then C, through this secure connection, can deliver any key to A and B, and then A and B can start communicating. This secure connection is guaranteed through a different way, and one of them is user authentication. We'll see how this happens. Okay, so that's this is the more well-known technique for distributing the keys. Is that you have a centralized entity that somehow it's trusted, and we have sort of a secure communication with this entity. And again, we'll see the security requirement for this link. It's not necessarily total confidentiality. We'll see how this happens in some cases, yani. And then we can get the shared key from this third party, and then from now on we can use that key for end-to-end secure connection.
Can I turn on the AC?
Yeah, please.
It's too hot.
So we said number one and 2, which is manual exchange of keys. That's not really reasonable, especially if we're talking about a big distributed system. It's not feasible. And number 3 has the chain effect. If you break 1 key, then you broke the whole communication. So it's not really effective. So for number 4, we have 2 types of keys in that case. We have the session key. The session key is the shared key that's temporarily deployed to A and B to communicate. And we have a permanent key, which is somehow used to distribute the session keys. Okay? So if you have a permanent key, you can use that permanent key, which is exchanged between the A and B with C. Okay? So this permanent key can be used to encrypt the session key and distribute the session key to A and B to start communicating.
Doctor, is it an example for this when you have like a static part to the server, and then you have the token part, which is the dynamic part that keeps on changing.
No. The token is something else. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about this. A token is usually used with user authentication. These keys are used for encryption, okay, to guarantee confidentiality during communication. And in some cases, طبعا, we're using also these keys for signatures. صح? We talked about this, to generate the MAC, or message authentication codes, right? So in that case, we're not encrypting the message, we're encrypting the signature itself, or the hash of the message. You need to review the previous chapter. You need to work on that. أيوة. Which obviously you're not.
The third party or the trusted party, when we communicate with A or B, we use key or signature or what?
The whole chapter is talking about this. Don't worry. I mean, I know things are part of the puzzle is really vague now, but it will become very clear once we start talking about the first key distribution technique. Okay, so bear with me 1 or 2 minutes, and it will be very clear. All right. So again, we said that in many cases we're using a centralized entity. Sometimes we call this a key distribution center. So the key distribution center grants two systems to establish a connection and provides a one-time session key to these two. So you have A and you have B. Okay? So each of them initially will connect to key distribution center. Okay? Through this, they get the same key. So A will send a request to KDC to tell it, I'm interested to communicate with B. And of course, as part of this, A has to prove his identity and so on and so forth, as we'll see. B will do the same, independently. Okay? And then KDC will send the same key to A and B, and once this key is delivered through this secure communication, then A and B will start to communicate using that key.
So is that the permanent key? The one between
The between A and KDC and B and KDC, that's the permanent key. That's the permanent key. So, in other words, we secure this connection using the master key or the permanent key, and then we'll use this master key between. It's semi-permanent, by the way. It's not permanent. معناها إن هي. It's semi-permanent. Okay, and then we'll use that to distribute the shared key. The shared key is temporary. It's temporary. And then later on, if we want to generate another key, we'll use the permanent key to generate a new key and so on. Okay? So that's the scenario that's described here. So A will connect to KDC and try to present some proof of identity and so on and so forth, which is using the master key or the permanent key. We'll see how that happens. And then if KDC approves, then KDC will generate a unique one-time session key to A. B will do the exact same process independently. Okay? And by knowing the fact that A wants to communicate to B, so we'll deliver the same one-time session key to B. And then A and B will have the same key, so they will start to communicate. So that's, of course, when I send the shared key, it's encrypted by the master key. So we'll see how that happens. So if we're trying to distribute these keys in distributed systems or a network with n nodes, okay? So if we were to talk about shared key, so KDC will need to distribute how many keys to these nodes? So if your network has n different nodes, each node needs to communicate with all the other nodes, n-1 nodes. It needs to have a separate key. But then you need to make sure that you're not repeating these keys. So it's a selection process. You select one key for each two communicating parties. So it's NC2. So in a network of n nodes, assuming that you have like a mesh type communication, all nodes are interested to communicate with all the other nodes. So how many keys you need? So it's complexity, it's O of A. This is O of A of n squared for people who studied complexity before. Okay, so this is O of n squared. And for public encryption, each node will have 2 keys that are semi-permanent, right? So we'll have a private key and a public key. Public key will be known to all, and the private key is exclusive to one node. So in other words, each node will have 2 keys. So it's actually the number of keys is 2n, which is O of n, right? So that's why we said that one of the advantages of public key is the simplicity of sharing these keys in a network, right? So it's not trivial, and we'll see it can get complicated, but it's more simplified compared to symmetric key encryption. مفهوم الكلام ده جدا؟
How often is the private key gets regenerated?
Very less often. It's not. We'll talk about this. Usually use it for days, unless there is some kind of a. Actually, we'll see that we exchange these keys in a form of a certificate. Okay, and usually use the certificate for days before either it gets revoked or expired. So usually you actually use it for days, and in some cases for months. Okay. But of course, symmetric key encryption is still desirable because of the complexity in the encryption process itself. As we mentioned before, for the same size of key, public encryption tends to be more complicated. Okay. Here we'll add public encryption to the assignment number 2, just to make it more interesting and try to compare. So with that said, for symmetric encryption, to use it for key distribution, the state-of-the-art technology is what we call KERBEROS. KERBEROS is a standard or a protocol which is developed by MIT. And it's the state-of-the-art when it comes to user authentication and key distribution in a distributed system. So the motivation behind using KERBEROS is the fact that if you assume that you have a distributed system in which users at workstations, they wish to access services on servers. So you have sort of so you have like a workstation, and you have a person who is trying to work on this workstation, and this subject or the person, he or she wants to access many servers in the enterprise. Cloud storage, email server, things like that. Okay. So in a system like this, which is highly distributed, we need to use symmetric encryption to, on one hand, guarantee the authentication or the identity of that user on this workstation. And then based on that, we use this information to ensure and guarantee the access of that person, if he is authorized to do that, with the different servers. So the risk here is that, assume that there are different types of attacks that we need to worry about when it comes to this simple scenario. A user may gain access to a particular workstation, so you have now, like Darth or Eve, who was trying to attack, so he can try to somehow gain access to this workstation, either by breaking your user ID and password or something like this. and he can gain access to your workstation to try to impersonate himself as if he's you. And based on that, he can get access to this server as if he or she is that person. Or another scenario, which is a user may alter the network address, so I'm going to use another workstation, and then through that workstation, somehow I will manage to send these servers requests as if it's coming from this workstation. So I will spoof the IP address and this and that, and somehow I will impersonate myself as another person working on different workstation other than the one that I'm working on. So I can easily use the same IP address and MAC address and this and that to try to fool the system. So what if you are using encryption? So he cannot easily do this except that if he knows the key. Then comes the third one, which is a user may eavesdrop on exchange of messages, and he can get this message and replay it at different time, even if it's encrypted. This is what we call a replay attack. Okay? So these are different attacks that we need to worry about in these types of systems. In addition to this, we need to also make this experience convenient for users. So we need to make sure that once we authenticate this user to this workstation, okay, so nowadays we do this authentication through credentials. So we need to make sure that once you authenticate and you enter your credentials, that every time you are accessing your email, we don't have to ask you for user ID and password every time. Right? So somehow we need to also minimize that, make it more convenient. Okay? So when we do that on a certain system, will it be valid for other systems or other servers or not? That's another issue. So for that, the MIT has come up with what we call KERBEROS. KERBEROS, I thought at the beginning it stands for something, but it turns out to be a Greek name. I don't know for what, but it's a Greek name. Anyway, it provides a centralized authentication server. It's like KDC, remember the Key Distribution Center. And this centralized authentication server will authenticate users to servers and services, okay, in the distributed system. And it relies exclusively on symmetric encryption. So it will not use any public encryption. So how can we do this using symmetric encryption? We'll see that. Okay? So there is version 4 and version 5. The main difference between the two, of course, there are some security breaches and security issues that appeared with version 4. In version 5, they have replaced some encryption techniques, like instead of DES, they use AES, something like that. Because at the beginning in version 4, they used to use DES, and as we said before, DES turns out to have some issues in terms of crypto analysis. So AES came to try to have the same performance like triple DES, but in a much less complexity compared to triple DES. Okay. So some people they have generated time duration for AES more than triple DES for the assignment. So that does not make sense. Okay, so AES it should give you much less complexity. So that's one example of what they have introduced in version 5 compared to version 4. So in terms of jargon for KERBEROS version 4, it uses a basic third-party authentication scheme. It uses what we call authentication server. So authentication server is the very first line of interface to the user. The user will present his credentials, assuming that he's already registered, okay, to that authentication server. So user initially negotiate with the authentication server to identify himself or herself, and then the authentication server will provide a non-corruptible authentication credential, which is what we call granting server ticket. So the way to kind of feel this is like, imagine that you are really entering like a cinema or something like this. So once you present your identity, your name to the front desk and so on and so forth, and say that I want to pay and I want to watch a movie in a particular cinema, then they give you a ticket. This ticket it really identifies you and identifies the server or the service that you are allowed to take. And in many cases, this is limited by duration. صح?
Yes.
Okay, so that's exactly what it is. As we will see, once you present your initial credentials to the authentication server will prove or will verify your identity and will verify your credentials, and then will give you a ticket which ensures that now you are eligible to take basic service, okay, for a duration of time. For this duration of time, it's important because, as we said, we don't want you to enter your user ID and password every time, right? So this ticket will ensure that once it's valid, as long as it's valid, you can always present it as is to anyone and get this service, okay? Without having to really re-enter your user ID and password every time. And of course, we don't have to do this physically. And if we want to check our emails, the client will do this for us. We'll get the copy of the ticket, and then it will send it every time it needs to have access to our emails. We don't have to have, it's an electronic ticket in our case. Huh? It's not a physical ticket. But this is just to imagine how it works. Once you present your credentials, you get a ticket which says that you are allowed to access certain part of the system for a duration of time. واضح كده؟ طيب. Since we have this, why do we need to have another entity which is called ticket granting server? So you have to present this generic ticket to another server, which gives you another ticket, which is this server or this entity is called ticket granting server. So users subsequently request access to other services. So this initial ticket is not for a specific service. واضح? It's for entering the system. It's like you are entering now the cinema, but which hall or which movie you are going to watch, then you have to sort of again present this ticket, and then we prove that it's valid. And imagine that we are taking this ticket and we give you another one for this particular movie. Or you can decide to watch another movie, so we have to take this ticket and give you the ticket for the other movie, something like that. So here, what we're doing is that we're getting an entry point to the system, and then now I want to access the email server. Okay? So I have to present this to the ticketing granting server and ask this server that I want to have access to the email. So this server is going to give you a ticket that you are allowed to access your email through the email server, and it will give you a ticket which again now it tells you that you are allowed to communicate with the email server for a duration of time. واضح كده؟ So this authentication server is for first entry to the system, and then from there you can access different services and servers. ماشي? Email server, cloud storage, things like that, because we're talking about a distributed system. Once we do this, we can now communicate with email server, cloud storage, things like that, and we start communicating using the shared key, using this ticket. We'll see visually how this happens.
لا بس
We will talk about the details of this all. يعني. اتفضل.
why not depend on the role of the user instead of having a server that grants tickets for services?
ما هو احنا بقى قلنا بقى يعني having ليه بقى the mentality of really having centralized entity to do this really simplifies the control. يعني دايما كده if you have a centralized entity, on one hand it makes the control easy and it makes the protection of this server much easier. If you rely on each server to grant these tickets to any user, okay, then as an administrator or someone who's really protecting this system, it makes your job much harder. Okay? But of course, on the other side, centralized entity makes a single point of failure. So, but again, we have some solutions for this that we can have يعني sort of redundancy to the system and backups, and we can have this. So we know how to do this. It's much easier. Okay? And as we all know, دايما when we decentralize any job, it makes it very hard. An example is blockchain. It makes job very hard. In some cases, you have to, because you don't have to trust one entity. You don't want to do that. In that case, you are forced to. Okay, but in our cases, distributed systems, it doesn't necessarily mean distributed function. Okay, having a centralized entity to do this makes it easy, and you just have to trust that I will do this job for you. You have no other way. It's like you're trusting the bank.
Yeah.
Do you have a choice? You don't have a choice. I have to. I don't have any other choice. So in a way, you are forced to, and it makes my job easy. Okay, so that's the mentality behind it. All right, so let's imagine that scenario. If user C logs on to a workstation in the morning and wishes to check his or her email at server V. So that's the scenario now, that we want to have a user who logs on to a workstation and he's trying to access the email server. So in that case, this user will authenticate himself or herself through entering like user ID and password. But does that mean that this user will enter the password in clear text, and it will be, because we're talking about authenticating this user with the email server, right? So does that mean that I have to send the password as clear text to that email server? Of course, that cannot work. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. So we shouldn't actually send the password as clear text to the server. That doesn't work. That doesn't make any sense. But we're trying to do this to distribute the keys, and until then, we don't have any keys to encrypt. So how can we do that? Type. The other thing is that if C wishes to check the email in the afternoon, or after 1 hour, or after 2-3 minutes, does that mean that he or she will have to enter the user ID and password every time? Of course, that also needs to be taken care of. So in that case, once you log on to the system, I'm going to give you a ticket, and this ticket is going to be reusable. Okay? So every time you want to access, you just need to send this ticket. But then this ticket needs to be encrypted again, because if we're sending this ticket as clear text, then it defeats the purpose. So this ticket needs to somehow be unforgeable or protected, unbreakable. Okay? So that's another challenge that we have. So, and again, we need that user to get new ticket for every single service he or she wants. Right? So we need to allow different access to subsystems. So the access to the email is different from access to telnet, is different from access to certain server, and so on. Right? So you need a ticket for every single service in this system. Okay? So that's the job of the ticket granting server. So first, the authentication server will give you a generic ticket for entering the system, and then you present this ticket to this server, you get a specific ticket to a particular service. واضح كده؟ Clear? So that's the idea behind it. So how can we do this? By prayer first. Okay. All right, so we've talked about the elementary requirements for these types of systems. So again, here we have a user who wants to log on to a workstation and have access to different servers in this distributed system. So the KERBEROS actually divides this into 3 stages. First is that the user has to present his or her credentials to the authentication server. So this is the authentication server. And then at the end, he or she will get a temporary session key, okay, and a ticket. This session key will be used to communicate with the ticket granting server. So this is step number 1, and this is step number 2. Okay? So for the ticket granting server, this server will be able to authenticate again the user to be able to access a particular service. So this could be like an email server or something like this. Okay? So this is step number 2. And again, I will get back, in that case, a shared key to be able to use it for communication with that server, and a ticket which grants you this communication to that server for a duration of time. So this is step 3. So there are 3 levels of authentication here. Okay? Then is number 3, you will send again your request to this particular server to start accessing your email or your service. So, and again, the initial step in here is again to identify yourself to that server to start communication. Okay? But then at that point you will have established the session key between you and this particular server, and you can start communicating normally. Remember here, the requirement is that we need to send a session key to allow the client to communicate with the TGS, the ticketing granting server. Okay? So there should be an established shared key between the client and TGS server. And a ticket which the user can later on present to authenticate himself to this TGS server without having to again introduce himself using the user ID and password. So here we said we only need the session key and the ticket. As we have highlighted here, this one is done once per service. So if you want to have multiple services, you have to do this for email, you have to do this for every single server you want to communicate with. واضح? So that's the timeline. Again, we'll dig into how this really works step by step. So that's the timeline. So at the beginning, يعني ده محتاج تركيز شوية. So the client, which represents a user sitting on a workstation, will send a message. And as we said before, it's one of the requirements that we should not send the password as a clear text to the server. Okay? So the way to do that is that the client will send a request. This request is to say, I want to communicate with the ticket granting server. And you identify yourself by the ID only. Okay? You send only your username. Only your username. You don't send your password in any way. Okay? And this is a timestamp. which we will talk about later. This timestamp basically يعني, is to avoid the replay attack. As we said before, in the beginning, in lecture 1, if you remember, one of the techniques to avoid the replay attack is to use timestamp to make sure that this message is actually a fresh message. Okay, so I like to put this message in a slightly different form. So it's ID of the ticket granting server, and this is what you want to communicate to. And by that, you are representing yourself using the ID and the timestamp. Okay? It's the same, but it's just switching, and I'll tell you why I'm actually doing this. This is, we call it authenticator. And this is a target system that you want to communicate with. So this identifies the user, and this identifies the target system that you want to communicate with. Okay? Type. What will happen is that the authentication server will send you this message. The first step is that, remember, you are authenticating yourself to an authentication server. So the authentication server should have your password of some sort. You did not send your password, صح? But the password should have it, and usually should have it in a way that's unforgeable. In many cases, it's a hashed copy of the password. صح? It's not, again, it's not stored on the system in plain text. It doesn't make any sense. So the way normally that happens is that this password is stored in a hashed format, which means that you cannot really get it back. But using this hash, you can extract a key from this hash. So it is a key which is generated from your password. واضح كده؟ Okay? It's not your password. You did not send your password. But the authentication server will extract a key from your password, whether it's from the hash of your password, or we can use this hash as an index to a repository to get a scheduled key from that repository based on this hash. In all cases, this process is well known at the authentication server and at the workstation side. Okay? Because only those two parties, they know the password. Okay? So this step is very important. Because if I can extract a hash copy of your password, I can now use this hash version as a key to encrypt. See this KC? KC is a key extracted from the password of workstation C, of the client. واضح? Okay? Okay. So I will use this key to encrypt two things. A session. So the authentication server will respond with a message which is encrypted with a key that's based on the password. This message will contain the session key, KCTGS, which means a shared key between the client and the TGS server. This is the shared key. And a ticket. This ticket, you will see the format of this ticket in the next slide, how it looks like. This ticket, it's a grant from the authentication server to the client to be able to access TGS for a duration of time. This duration of time is identified by lifetime. Okay? So the response, the whole response message is going to be encrypted with the password-based key, which means that only the client who has this password will be able to get the hash, use it as a key to decrypt that message, to get the two unknowns, which are the session key and the ticket. Okay? The ticket itself, as we said, it should be encrypted. But should the client be able to decrypt the ticket? The answer is no. Okay? So you don't know, it's as if like you are presenting this ticket to the man in the front door. You don't know how this ticket is actually formatted. It's like coded in certain way, but the guy has like a reader, but you are not supposed to be able to regenerate this ticket in any way. ماشي كده؟ All right, so there are two extra pieces of information which we don't know why they are presented. احنا قلنا session key, that's fine. We'll use the session key to encrypt further parts of the communication in the next message. So that's understandable. So the shared key is required. Yes, we know that. The ticket, well, it's also required because this is the grant from us so that we don't have to go through authentication again. But we have the ID, TGS, and the timestamp 2 and the lifetime 2. These are presented as extra information. So we'll talk about why we need this. All right, so now I was able to share a session key between the client and the TGS server. صح? Okay? This key is now shared between those two entities and nobody else knows about them, hopefully. Okay? So the user now wants to gain access to a particular service bar, okay? Which is like email services. So in that case, the user would say, okay, I want to access a particular server, email server or something. This email server is this service provider, okay? And for this, I can present my ticket and I'm presenting my authenticator. Now, this authenticator is an encrypted message using the shared key, which identifies my ID to the TGS server. And now I can do this because the session key is only known by me and the TGS server. Okay? So only in this step, I have sent a clear text of what? Of my username. Okay? Because I don't yet have a shared key. Okay? But we were able to work around the password by using the password to generate a key to encrypt the response. Once we encrypted the response, I can send the basic ingredient in this response, which allows me to encrypt all the messages coming further. So I've used this KECTGS to encrypt this authenticator, which introduces my ID to that server. Okay? How can TGS verify my authentication? Using both authenticator and the ticket. Okay? So the ticket is something that I have, but I don't know the content. Authenticator is something that represents myself, and I know the content. So I can present this to the TGS server using the shared key. Okay? And I'm presenting the ticket to confirm that this is really my identity. And I'll tell you why. Because, well, I can get this ticket and I can replay it. But will I be able to authenticate myself to the TGS server? No, because I don't have the shared key. Okay? So even if you get into this communication and try to be smart and say, okay, I'm going to get a copy of the ticket, and later on, before this ticket expires, I can just replay it and try to authenticate myself to the TGS server, right? But you will not be able to because you don't know the shared key, right? You know the shared key only if you have the password, right? You will be able to decrypt this message to get the shared key and then use this shared key to authenticate yourself to the TGS server. We'll see again in the next slide the exact format of these messages. So here, I will get access to the service using 3 components. One, I'm specifying the service I want to have access to. I want to have access to the email server. This is IDV. Okay? And for this, I have to send the ticket, which is a grant for me to be able to access the TGS server, right? And I'm presenting my authenticator, which has my user ID encrypted with the shared key. So only the TGS server will be able to decrypt it and get my ID out of it. واضح? Okay? So then the TGS server will verify my authentication through these 2 components. We'll be able to decrypt the authenticator using the shared key. And as we will see, it will also be able to decrypt the ticket. Only the TGS server, the user can't. And through those 2, I can easily verify that you have a grant to access the TGS server with the proper user ID. Okay? If I compare those 2, and the answer is yes, you are really the person that you are granted this ticket, and you cannot impersonate yourself using someone else because you don't have the shared key, okay? Then you are granted to communicate with this server. Then I will give you another ticket, which is ticket V, okay? To be able to use it to authenticate yourself to who بقى? To the service provider. Okay? And then you send your authenticator again, but this time using the shared key with the service provider. Okay? Because as part of this, as you can see here, using the shared key between me and the TGS server, I will give you a session key between C and V. معايا ولا العملية ملخبطة؟ I'm giving you a key, a session key, one-time temporary session key, okay, for the service itself, not as a generic for the TGS server, but this time for a specific service. And this one is, and in that case, the response will have, using the shared key, I will send you a session key between C and the server, service provider, and I will give you a ticket, which again, it's a grant for you to be able to communicate with the service provider for a duration of time, so that you don't have to again present yourself every single time to the service provider. Based on that, you can now send your, you don't want to communicate, you want to now communicate with V, so you can just authenticate yourself to V. خلاص. So we don't have to communicate with any other service provider, but you can present yourself to this service provider by the ticket and the authenticator. ماشي? So 3 steps. First step, I want to communicate with the ticket granting server, and I'm presenting yourself. The first time using only my ID, okay? Because I don't yet have any shared key. I will get a message encrypted with a key that's based on my password, and this message has 2 major things. I'll get it. 2 major things: a ticket and a session key. Using the session key, I will send it to the TGS server, okay, to present myself and request to communicate with a service provider, like an email server or something, okay? So TGS will, using the session key, will be able to decrypt my authenticator to identify the authenticity of me, and then verify that against the ticket. Using those two components, I will be confirmed that I'm the person I'm saying I am, okay? And in that case, the TGS will grant me another ticket to be able to communicate with the service provider. In the service provider, I'm just presenting myself to the service provider. I am a person. I have this ticket to communicate to you, and this is my identity. That's it. So you get the communication going, and that's it. So
I just didn't understand one part. The keys. So for the first one, you said that we use the password of the user to generate some key.
Right.
And only if the user has the right password, then he can decrypt.
Right.
Okay. For the second one, communicating with the TGS.
Using the shared key that I have achieved from the first step.
Ah, okay.
Right? So in the first step, هو عشان كده بنقول your credentials is the first line of defense. If that's broken, then it's done. You're done. خلاص. If your password is known, خلاص. That's why يعني زي ما بقول لك 80% of the attacks they try to guess your password. If they know it, then you're done. All of this is useless. Okay? Any questions? طيب يعني again we'll dig more into this. So again, I like to format this slightly differently. So we'll put it as I want to communicate with TGS and I'm authenticating myself as I'm IDC and I'm sending this at timestamp 1. This way, make it consistent with all the messages. So I'm always requesting a message with a particular server, and this is my authenticator. Only in the first step, I'm sending my authenticator as a clear text. It only contains the ID, okay? And I get the response, which contains a message which is encrypted using KC, which is based on my password. And this message contains the ticket and a session key. Okay? Let's see about what this ticket contains. This ticket contains an encrypted message using the key of the TGS. This is a key which is only known by TGS. It's not even known by the client, remember. That's why we said the client will not be able to decrypt the ticket. Who will be able to decrypt the ticket? The TGS server. Okay? This reply is coming from where? This is what? It's coming from?
Yes.
طيب السؤال بقى how can the AS know the key for TGS? Right, so that's why we're saying that this authentication server is a centralized entity which authenticates everyone, either a user or a server or a process, everything. So this means that for TGS, this is not something that's written in the book. Huh? This is something that I had to really think about. I have to question myself at every single stage. Why they put this here? And you should be able to think that, critically. Okay? So KTGS is known through an implicit step, which is not part of this, that identifies the TGS server to the AS server, which is not part of this. Okay? واضح الحتة. So the AS knows the keys for every single entity, including a user, a process, a server, everything. ماشي? Through, again, an authentication step by each entity. طيب.
No, but in this case, to have better security, AS should only know about TGSs, and TGSs should only know about services or service providers.
يعني ايه؟ يعني بمعنى صح ان انت بتقول يعني ال AS should not know about the TGS?
No, should not know about the service points. For example, server V.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Yes, not necessarily. But TGS should.
Yes.
Yes, that's fine. That's okay. So it's like يعني what Ahmed is saying is like AS should know about the physical servers in the distributed systems, but it doesn't necessarily need to know everything about the services, the different services, or the service-specific servers. ماشي? ماشي, that's fine. That's okay. All right, so this message is encrypted by the TGS key, and this message, again, contains all the information that's part of it is outside. Okay? So again, this ticket is a grant to be able to communicate with the TGS server for a duration of time which is lifetime too. Okay? Who will be able to decrypt this? Only the TGS server. Where? Here. So in this step, when I get the session key and I present myself here, I present myself using the session key, and I'm presenting myself, I am this person with this ID. This ADC C is actually the IP address or address identification of that workstation. So not only I'm identifying myself, I'm authenticating myself on this workstation. So that again, if you are trying to impersonate this person on another workstation, you will not be able to because the IP address is different, but also you don't know the session key, so you'll not be able to authenticate yourself without the session key. Type. So this authenticator is now encrypted with the session key. When I present this message to the TGS server, the TGS server will be able to encrypt both the authenticator and the ticket. صح? صح ولا لا? Right? Using the KTGS, I can always decrypt the ticket. Okay? And using the authenticator, I can using the session key, I can decrypt the authenticator. So the authenticator is specific to the communication, and the ticket is encrypted with my own semi-permanent key, so I can decrypt both. So using the decryption for both, I can confirm the identity of that user using ID and IP address. And I could never know this except if I'm presenting the right ticket and I'm giving my identification which matches what's in the ticket. And I could not have forged this because I cannot really copy that ticket. Okay? I cannot regenerate that ticket. Okay? So if in step 3, this client is authenticated successfully, then this client is requesting to have communication with the service provider or the email server. Okay? So in here we have 3 different parts. So the ticket from the TGS, which is presented here, is the same like what we have copied from here. The authenticator here contains my identity encrypted with the session key. And in the response, I will grant you, because you are requesting to communicate with the service provider, with V. So in the response, I should send you again a one-time session key to communicate with the server, with the service provider, and I will give you a ticket which grants you this communication for a duration of time. Okay? Which you will be able to use in the 3rd step. So in the 3rd step, all you need to do, you don't here, I'm not requesting to communicate with any specific server. So it's like, again, عشان بس to understand the hierarchy, the way you do it is that this is the authentication server. From it, you communicate with the TGS server, And from this TGS server, you communicate with server 1, server 2, server 3, and so on. So it's a tree. واضح? So that's why here, you don't want to communicate from S1 to further. So that's why there's nothing actually presented here. You don't want to request communication with any other servers because it's a tree. So أقصد V is the terminal node in the tree. So all you need to do is just to present your authentication information to that server, and that's it. And from now on, you can communicate, you can send data, you can get data, and خلاص. You have a shared key already. So the first step is to present yourself. Presenting yourself is always done by a authenticator ticket, both. Authenticator and the ticket. From the authenticator and the ticket, the server will authenticate you, will make sure that you are identified, and then it will start communicating with you. So in terms of communication flow, that's how it looks like, from AS to TGS, from TGS to the different servers. واضح؟ Okay, so now, طيب خلينا بقى يعني نتست your understanding to it. So we said that here, just to flip it, just to make it consistent, and we explained how we can authenticate and the response and how we can share the shared key in the response and everything. So why do we need to have the ID TGS in the response and in the ticket itself? And if you notice here, the ID is not here, which we said why, because we don't want to request any further service from any other server. And here, this ID is not there. And the third question is, where did I get this ADC C from if it's not in the response? So AS sent back ADC C, right? And sent in the ticket itself, I'm putting IDC, and outside, I'm putting ID TGS outside. And I'm putting the lifetime outside the message and inside the message. All these are not explained in the book in any way, shape, or form. Okay? So we need to think about it. So first of all, the simplest one. Where did I get the IP address? Bravo عليك. So الراجل هو الوحيد اللي مصحصح الناس المفروض يعني مصحصح. Okay, so I'm sending this as part of a protocol. IP packet. From the IP packet, I can get the IP address. Okay, so I know that this address, this request, is coming from this workstation. Right? So the authentication server will read the IP address from the packet header, and will sort of stamp it in the ticket that this user is allowed to communicate with TGS from that workstation with this IP address. Okay? So that if you're trying to impersonate yourself using any other workstation, then you cannot. But you cannot anyway because you don't have the session key. Merci? So that's question number one. So why do we have to have redundancy in the message response that TGS, ID TGS is outside the message, and again, it's inside the ticket? Why do we need to send it outside and inside?
To read it, check.
To a?
To check it.
To mean check it.
TGS.
الكلاينت؟
client.
ليه؟
عشان نتأكد
لا هو عملت شغل واضح. ها؟ ليه بقى؟ عشان يتأكد ايه بقى؟
نفس الشخص identity.
يعني هو الكلاينت هيتشيك الشخصية بتاعته هو؟
لا مش الشخصية بتاعته.
ايوه.
reuse the ticket.
ما هو التيكت خلاص انا معايا التيكت. I have the ticket so I'll be able to to use the ticket later on. But why does AS, the authentication server, need to send some duplicate information outside the ticket back to the client?
To authenticate.
أيوة, to authenticate what to what?
The user.
Take it to the user.
And
Yeah.
to check that the
Identity of
packet
the
has not been
response.
changed throughout the transaction.
Is that, how could it be changed?
By a third party, by someone. If
ماشي.
If you use another.
middleman.
Okay. يعني صح, you are thinking right. So this is called mutual authentication. Just the fact that AS is trying to communicate my credentials, I also have to confirm the identity and the authorization of the AS server. Because someone can actually say, okay, I am the server, and he can send me back some false information. Okay? But this guy doesn't know my password. So the first level is that I need to decrypt this message using my password. Okay? And if this message is decrypted, this ID TGS will match what's in the original message. For me, this is a type of authentication from me to the AS server.
And vice versa.
Yes. So it's like server is authenticating me and I'm authenticating back the server. Okay? Because someone might impersonate my identity to the server, but also someone might impersonate the server to myself. All right? So you will find that always I have in the request, I have something in the response to confirm that really this response is coming from the right server. One thing is the password. Okay? So after, if I have the right password and the server has the right password, then I will be able to decrypt this message, which is good. So now I have the right ticket, which I can use it later on for authentication. That's fine. But also I have to make sure of the identity of the AS server, and that happens through confirming this ID TGS. So diamond you have in the request and the response, you have something for what we call a mutual authentication. So I'm authenticating myself to the server, and the server is authenticating himself back to you. ماشي? So authentication is actually bi-directional process, not one direction. Because if you're authenticating yourself to the server, you trust the server. But how can you trust anyone 100%? So someone might impersonate the server and... Okay. All right, so the lifetime is in the response for efficiency reasons only. Yani that's the only thing I found. Yani. For efficiency reasons is that
You can look at lifetime.
the workstation itself will store this lifetime so that if the person is trying to, again, access the email, it doesn't have to go to the server to know whether this ticket is valid or not. It just needs to store it locally and say, if the lifetime is expired, then it will present again the login ID and password to the user to put it again. All right? And if you notice, this lifetime is not actually propagated further, because only the first logon is through the AS server. It's not through any other service. Okay, so it's always stored in the local workstation that you log on for the first time. But other than that, you don't have to store it every time, and that's why it's shown here, but it's not here. And the timestamp we set for for avoiding the replay attacks. ماشي? To avoid replay attack. طيب, the mutual authentication here is done because I'm not sending any identifier for a server to request communication with. So the mutual authentication here is done using an interesting technique. So we have a timestamp which is based on the timestamp in the authenticator. Sorry, here. So you see that this is TS5 and this is TS5. يعني the mutual authentication here is done by between this and this, صح? Mutual authentication here is done by IDV and IDV in the response. So in the request and the response, the client is using some piece of information to confirm that this is the exact server that sent this message. But here there is nothing in the request. So it uses the timestamp for mutual authentication, which is a little bit interesting. Yeah. It was for me at least. ماشي? These are details, بس يعني I thought it's interesting. It's not explained in the book, but it tells you يعني how these people, when they design these protocols, what level of details that they have to worry about. And that's the same level of thinking that you should have when you start to design a certain protocol. You need to really think about all types of scenarios and address all these types of scenarios in your protocol design. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we'll give an introduction about the asymmetric key encryption for the case of key distribution, and then we'll continue next time, inshallah. So that's the state of the art when it comes to key distribution and user authentication for the case of symmetric keys. So if you notice the KERBEROS, it uses exclusively symmetric keys. It doesn't use any public keys at all, right? And it relies on user authentication using the password, and it achieves all these requirements in terms of hierarchical service provisioning and this concept of tickets that can take two levels between the AS to the ticket granting server and so on. For asymmetric encryption, key exchange takes a totally different concept altogether. Okay, so there are two distinct aspects to the use of public keys. So first, the distribution of the public keys. So we also, as we said, public keys can be exchanged. It's given, it's known by everyone, but is it really? Or we have to have certain precautions? Or, يعني for me, if I get your public key, should I trust it? يعني خلاص? Of course not. There has to be some level of precautions. And the use of public key encryption بقى to distribute the secret keys. And that's like Diffie-Hellman technique that we talked about last time. It's used to exchange keys. Or RSA. In fact, the standards that we will talk about, it uses RSA. It doesn't use, because we said RSA is for general purpose. It can be used for key exchange, it can be used for encryption and decryption and so on. So for exchanging the public key, we usually opt to using what we call certificate. Certificate is nothing but the public key signed by a certain hash or a certain signature. This signature, in some cases, is again encrypted, which gives anyone a guarantee or a confidence that it's coming from you and not anyone else. As we said, message authentication or message authentication codes are techniques to encrypt the hash or the signature to make sure that it's coming from the right person, and this hash is, or the data itself is, has data integrity. So public key certificates consists of the public key and the user ID. And from the user ID, we can again extract some keys which we can use to encrypt the signature, and using those two, we can guarantee that this public key is coming from the right person. Again, do we have to encrypt the public key itself? No. صح? We don't have to encrypt the public key. It should be well known to everyone. So there is no requirement to encrypt the public key itself. But there is a requirement to guarantee the authenticity of the person who is sending the public key. تمام كده؟ Yes, and that's achieved using the certificate. The certificate is the public key plus a signed hash, which gives you confidence that this is coming from the right person. So typically, this right person, using the same concept that we talked about, this person is actually not the communicating party directly. This is actually a centralized entity, which is what we call certificate authority. Okay? So this certificate authority is a centralized entity which everybody should trust. Okay? Everybody can identify themselves to this certificate authority, and this certificate authority will generate a certificate that guarantees the correct identity of all of us, and will use that to sign a signature of the public key of me, and then I will be able to exchange to everyone. So in other words, I don't actually get my public key and I send it like this, and I don't sign the public key with my own private key, مثلا. No. I authenticate myself to a certificate authority. This certificate authority will confirm my identity and will give me a signed hash, which I will append to the public key, and then I'll be able to send this public key or the certificate to everyone. So we'll see it graphically now. Now this is using my user ID.
بس الباسورد؟
لا، ما هو using your user ID and password, and sometimes it asks you for some information. This could be done on an enterprise level, or it could be done on individual level. So you can log on to a certificate authority. You can give all the information about yourself and your user ID and your identity and everything. And this certificate authority will say, okay, so you are authorized. You are confirmed to be the person who say you are, and giving my authorization. Everyone can trust me.
keep the
So I will.
information يعني عندها بحيث كل مرة بتعمل نفس الشيء.
What do you mean?
بقول لك keep this information يعني.
Yes. Yeah, unless you change your information. In that case, the generated certificate that you have becomes useless. So there should be a technique first to create or generate a certificate about you, which represents your identity and your public key, that you will be able to exchange with everyone. And this certificate, once I send to everyone, everyone should trust. Because it's not coming from me in that case. It's coming from a well-trusted identity, which is the certificate authority. It's not coming from me. But everyone should trust. Okay? And then if it happens that I change my information, or I change my identity in any way, or I change my location, or I change anything, then there should be also a mechanism to revoke my certificate at any point. So those are the two pillars. So this is how it looks like.
هو كان نفسه تكتب myself to CA.
To
To CA.
to the certificate authority يعني. That's how it should look like يعني graphically. So I have now the information of Bob. So Bob has certain identifiable information, which he or she can present. Bob he can present to the certificate authority. Okay. And as part of this, Bob also puts his public key, which is the clear text. ماشي? And then the certificate information, if the certificate information can prove your identity, it can add its own information, and then this is done by the certificate authority, not by you. And then it will deal with all these as one message. It will create a hash, using about one of the techniques that we talked about. And this is a one-time process, right? And this hash, it will be encrypted by the private key of what? لا,
Yes.
of the CA.
Yeah.
Okay? Of the CA. It's like a stamp. خلاص إن أنا دلوقتي the certificate authority would say I guarantee this public key that it can be exchanged with everyone. Okay? Then if this goes to any بقى Bob or any other person or any other user, it should be trusted. Why? Anyone would have the public key of the certificate authority, okay, and we'll talk about this in details. And then if you have the public key of the certificate authority, you will be able to authenticate Bob's public key by decrypting the hash. And if you are verified that this hash is the correct hash generated from this message, then you verify that this message is coming from the certificate authority about the public key of Bob. So if you can do this step and it's verifiable, then you can use public key for Bob, and you guarantee because you trust this certificate authority. The only possibility that this is not trusted is if the private key or the certificate authority is compromised by having مثلا the private key broken into or something like that. ماشي? That could happen. It could happen. It's very unlikely, but it could happen. ماشي? So that's the process graphically. So you don't actually send the public key directly to people. There is something called, I'm not sure if you're aware of, self-signed certificate.
Oh, I can trust the CA myself as a client.
Why do you trust the bank? How can I trust the bank?
ما في أي
You don't have any other choice. You don't have any other choice. You don't have any other choice. ماشي? So this certificate authority is a centralized entity that's trusted by everyone. Okay? But it doesn't have to be everyone. We'll talk about that. فهمنا البروسيس جاي ازاي؟ So the public key of Bob is signed by the private key of the certificate authority. That's assuming that the identity of Bob is verified by the certificate authority. ماشي كده؟ Any questions so far? ما هو بقى once you do this process يا أحمد خلاص certificates these are files can be put everywhere anywhere. خلاص. It's done once and for all. It's not something dynamic unless one of two things. This certificate is like the ticket in a way. It has a lifetime. Okay? Although you can make it forever if you like. That's one thing. The other thing is that it may be not expired, but it's revoked. When it's revoked, maybe you change your name, you change your job, you change anything, you move from one enterprise to another, okay? Or a company changes its name or something like this. So this means that the information in the certificate becomes not valid anymore. So in that case, the certificate authority should distribute what we call revocation lists. We'll talk about this. ماشي? Which is here. Okay? And then send it back to me. Then I can get this signed certificate and then I can send it to everyone. So everyone would get my public key and he or she will verify that this is a correct public key and it's coming from Bob. How? So, by verifying the signature that is coming from the CA. I trust CA. I don't trust you. I trust CA. Sorry, I don't trust anyone. I trust CA. Okay? So everyone has a public key of the CA. Right? If I can decrypt the signature and I can verify that this is the hash for the right message, so then I have confidence about the message. The message contains what? Contains the public key of Bob. So now I trust Bob's public key. So that's how it works.
Yeah.
It's used
أيوة.
for HTTPS.
So with that, there is the standard which is X509. X509 دي بقى دي مشهورة جدا يعني المفروض يعني this is a very well known standard. It's part of the X500 standard. X500 standard is an umbrella of standards for directory services. If you work in any IT department, you should know what directory services are. Directory services are the centralized repository which maintains all kind of identity management, user ID and password, any keys, certificates. All these are managed and maintained by a centralized, we call it directory services. Okay? So the standards for this is called X500, and this is the very well-known standard which is implemented in one of the implementations called LDAP, if you have heard about it. Somebody heard about it? It's called LDAP. LDAP is one of the implementations for the X500 directory service standard, which is very famous. In QU here we have a centralized LDAP server. LDAP server maintains like a single sign-on user ID and password for every user. It maintains Active Directory, yes. And it maintains all the certificates for users, for enterprise, not only for QU, but for any other organizations that QU has an agreement with. And we'll talk about all of this. So it's a very detailed kind of umbrella standards. And part of it is X509, which defines the standards with respect to certificates only. ماشي كده? So in addition to this, there is identity management and all other things which we will talk about later. So this 509 is part of the 500 series of recommendations, which defines a framework for provision of authentication services by the X500 directory. It's like using this active directory service, we need to use the user ID and password or the credentials of the users to generate, maintain, and distribute certificates, okay, which represent the public key of the person or the entity to be used by others. The directory may serve as a repository of public key certificates, in addition to other things, okay? But that's what we care about now. It defines alternative authentication protocols based on the use of public key certificates and was initially issued in 88, يعني تاريخ مش مشكلة, which the latest version is version 7. Okay. No.
Or the ID of the person, for example, in QU.
Public key? No. Public key is different, totally different. Public key is used as part of the asymmetric encryption. Remember, you need to review the last lecture.
I mean, when you said the example of the directory server for the QU, it has the credentials of the users.
Yes.
So the public key.
What we do is that normally the way it works is that first I need to identify myself to the certificate authority, we said, right? How can I identify myself to the certificate authority?
You should be registered.
I should be registered.
Yeah.
My identity should be proved. Okay, if it's confirmed, then I get credentials. صح? When I get the credentials, I can use them to identify myself again to the different servers, whether to access the system or to access a specific service in the whole system. تمام? Okay. One way of doing this is through public keys.
So it's not the ID.
Public key I can generate it. No, it's not the ID. So public key I can generate it locally at any point in time. And we have talked about RSA as a way to do that. So I can generate my public key. مفيش مشكلة. Okay? But can I just send the public key to everyone? Why would anyone trust that this is the public key coming from me? Why would it not be coming from anyone else who's trying to impersonate my identity? So how can we do this? is that first, I need to identify myself to the certificate authority. And this certificate authority is trusted to everyone. So the certificate authority would get my public key, sign it using its own private key, which is here, but it's different, totally different from the username. Based on the use of public key cryptography and digital signatures, as we have talked about. The standard doesn't dictate the use of specific algorithm, although RSA is recommended. So you can use Diffie-Hellman, you can use any other technique. Okay? You can use any other technique you want, but RSA is sort of a, is recommended. So that's how the certificate looks like. انت اصلا يعني قاعد عامل لي. Okay. So that's how the certificate looks like. It's complicated, but again, the certificate is nothing but the most important thing is the public key information of Bob, which is signed by the CA private key. And everything else is just information, either about Bob or about the subject or about the certificate authority itself. Okay? But the most important things are this part and this part. That's it. Everything else is just information, extra information. But there is more details to it. There is some extensions from version 1 to version 2. There are some identification. So we'll talk about the details of this